The ballroom of the Fairmont Chateau Laurier smelled like white roses and old money, and Isabel Crane stood at the edge of it all, watching her ex-husband raise a glass of Moet to a room full of people who had never once asked how she was doing. She had not been invited to celebrate. She had been invited to be reminded of what she'd lost. 14 months earlier, Isabel had been sitting in the waiting room of a labor and delivery ward in Ottawa alone, filling out admission paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Marcus, her husband of 7 years, the man she had supported through 2 failed business ventures, and 1 very public humiliation at a pitch competition she had helped him prepare for, had texted her that afternoon. Not called, texted. "I need space. I've been unhappy for a long time. I'm sorry." She had read the message 4 times before the nurse called her name. Her daughter Wren was born at 11:47 that night. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. A full head of dark hair, and the most indignant expression Isabel had ever seen on a human face, as though the baby already knew the circumstances were unacceptable. Isabel had cried, not from joy, though that was there too, buried somewhere deep and warm, but from a specific hollow grief she hadn't had words for yet. The kind that comes when you realize the person who was supposed to be there simply isn't, and won't be, and probably never really was. Marcus Ellery had always been charming in the way that certain men are charming. Effortlessly, and mostly for his own benefit. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and made everyone feel chosen, and Isabel had spent years believing she was special for having been chosen by him. She had been 31 when they met at a fundraiser in Vancouver, a junior architect with a growing reputation, and a tendency to stay in the office until midnight. He had been between jobs, transitioning, he called it, and she had found that confidence magnetic. The way he talked about his ideas. The way he made everything sound inevitable. She had not understood then that she would be the one making it inevitable. That her salary would carry them through his gaps. That her connections would open the doors he walked through first. That her quiet, unglamorous steadiness would be the foundation on which he eventually built a life that didn't include her. When Marcus left, Isabel was 38, 9 months pregnant, and had just been passed over for a partnership at the firm where she had worked for 11 years. The timing was not coincidental. She would understand this later when she had the clarity that comes with distance. But in those first weeks, she was simply surviving. Night feeds and maternity leave paperwork, and learning how to cry without waking the baby. What she did not know in those early weeks was that Marcus had already moved on. That he had in fact moved on before he'd sent that text. That a woman named Celeste, younger, louder, the kind of person who described herself as an entrepreneur without apparent irony, had been in the picture for the better part of a year. Isabel found out from a mutual friend, the way you always find out. A text that said, "I thought you should know," followed by a screenshot that confirmed what some part of her had already suspected. She had not replied. She had set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, finished washing Wren's bottles, and gone to bed. The first year was not the worst year. The worst year had already happened. She just hadn't known it was happening. The first year after Marcus left was actually, in certain unexpected ways, clarifying. Isabel's maternity leave gave her time she hadn't had in a decade. Time to be still. Time to think. Time to sit in her apartment in the Glebe with Wren asleep on her chest and actually look at the life she'd been living from the outside. The way you look at a photograph of yourself from 10 years ago and think, "I didn't know then, but I know now." She had spent 7 years in a marriage that was mostly hers. The worrying, the planning, the managing of every detail Marcus found beneath his attention. The dental appointments, and the lease renewals, and the careful management of his mood on days when things hadn't gone his way. She had done all of it, and she had done it quietly because that was what she had believed love required. She understood now that it had not been love she was performing. It had been fear, fear of being alone, yes. But more than that, fear of admitting she had chosen wrong, fear of the story she would have to tell about herself if she walked away. So she had stayed, and staying had cost her in ways she was only beginning to count. But here was the thing about hitting the bottom of something. You could see the walls very clearly from there. Isabel went back to work when Wren was 4 months old, earlier than she'd planned, but the math didn't work otherwise. She found a daycare 3 blocks from the office. She renegotiated her contract. She had a very direct conversation with the managing partner, a woman named Christine whom she had always been a little afraid of, and she laid out, calmly and without apology, what she had contributed to the firm over the past decade and what she expected in return. The partnership offer came 6 weeks later. She did not call Marcus to tell him. Marcus, in the meantime, had been building a new life with considerable enthusiasm. He and Celeste had moved into a house in Rockcliffe Park. One of those gracious old neighborhoods where the trees are enormous and the houses look like they've always been there, even if the people inside them haven't. He had secured funding for a new venture, something in sustainable tech, and by all accounts, he was telling the story of his success in a way that quietly omitted the years Isabel had subsidized it. They announced their engagement 11 months after Isabel had given birth, alone, in a hospital where Marcus's name was listed on the admission forms as emergency contact, and he had not answered the call. Their wedding was to be held at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier. Spring, black tie, 200 guests. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Isabel's assistant, a young woman named Faye, had placed it on her desk without comment, which told Isabel that Faye had already seen the return address and made her own conclusions. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy. The calligraphy was impeccable. Inside, beneath the formal wording, someone, she suspected Celeste, had handwritten a note in the margin. "We hope you'll join us. It would mean so much to see how everyone has moved on." Isabel read that line 3 times, how everyone has moved on. She set the invitation down. She picked it up. She walked to the window that overlooked the canal, which was still frozen, pale blue in the February light, and she stood there for a long moment thinking about what kind of person sends that note. Then she thought about what kind of person she was going to be in response. She called her lawyer, then she called her sister, then she sat back down at her desk, pulled out a thick cream card, her firm stationery, the kind that felt substantial in your hand, and she wrote back, "Thank you for the invitation. I wouldn't miss it." What Marcus believed was that Isabel would arrive the way he expected her to arrive. Tired. Maybe a little thinner, or a little heavier, wearing something that almost worked, holding a glass of wine she didn't need in a room full of people who knew exactly how the story had gone. He expected her to be, in the way of women who had been left, visibly diminished, a reminder of the life he had improved upon. What he had told Celeste, that his ex-wife was difficult, fragile, that the marriage had been a long mistake he'd been too kind to end sooner. That she had never really understood his potential. What Celeste had told her friends, that she felt almost sorry for Isabel, but that some women simply didn't know how to hold on to a man. These conversations had happened at dinner parties, in the particular tone people use when they are performing generosity while actually performing cruelty. And they had made their way back to Isabel through the usual channels, the mutual friends who still cared, who texted with increasing discomfort as the wedding approached. "Are you actually going? Isa, you don't have to prove anything. You know why he invited you, right?" She knew. She had always been good at reading rooms. It was one of the skills that had made her an exceptional architect. The ability to understand what a space was designed to do, what it was designed to make you feel. Marcus had designed this moment very carefully. He wanted her in that ballroom because her presence, worn and alone, would be the final confirmation of his narrative. The proof that he had been right to leave. She had no intention of being his proof. 8 weeks before the wedding, Isabel had a meeting. The meeting was not unusual on its face. She had meetings like it regularly now, as a partner. A referral from a client in Vancouver. Someone interested in a commercial development in Ottawa's West End. A conversation that was supposed to last 45 minutes. It lasted 3 hours. The man's name was Alistair Vane, 53, originally from Halifax, with the kind of easy confidence that had clearly been earned rather than assumed. He ran a real estate development group. Mid-size but strategic. The kind of firm that built things that actually improved a neighborhood rather than simply replacing it. He had come to her specifically because of a mixed-use project she had designed in the Glebe that had won an award the previous spring. He had read the write-up. He had looked at the drawings. He had wanted to meet the person behind them. Isabel had met men like Alistair before. Successful, curious, attentive. She had been wary of attentiveness since Marcus, in the way that people are wary of food that once made them sick. But Alistair was attentive in a different way. He asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. He disagreed with her, twice, thoughtfully, and revised his position when she made a compelling argument. He did not perform charm. He was simply, straightforwardly present. They signed a project agreement 6 weeks later. Isabel did not think of it as anything other than business. She was honest with herself about that. She was not going to be the woman who collapsed into the first man who seemed decent. She had Ren, and she had her work, and she had carefully rebuilt a life that actually fit her, and she was not going to risk any of that for a feeling. But Alistair kept showing up. Not intrusively, just consistently. He came to the project site meetings and asked the right questions. He brought coffee to the morning ones without being asked, because he had noticed she always had a cup at the first meeting. He asked about Ren once, not in the probing way that some men did, as though children were a complication to be assessed, but in the way of someone who was simply interested in the person in front of him. He knew about the wedding. She hadn't told him directly, but the Ottawa professional community was not large, and Marcus's name was recognizable in certain circles. He had asked once carefully whether she was all right. She had said yes. He had not pushed. He had simply said, well, if you decide you want company, the invitation is open. She had thought about that for 3 weeks. 2 days before the wedding, Isabel made a series of phone calls that she had been planning, in one form or another, for months. The first was to her lawyer, to confirm the details of the child support agreement that Marcus had been quietly renegotiating, or rather attempting to renegotiate, in the way of men who believe that a certain amount of paperwork and delay will simply wear you down. The agreement had been finalized the previous week, significantly in Isabel's favor, after her lawyer had introduced certain financial records into the discussion that Marcus had apparently not expected her to have access to. The second call was to a woman named Sandra Osei, not a name on any guest list, and precisely the right persons for what Isabel had in mind. Sandra was a journalist, a good one. She covered business and culture for a national publication, and she had been trying to profile Isabel for 2 years. Isabel had always deflected. She was deflecting no longer. The third call was to Alistair. Yes, she said, I'd like the company. The night of the wedding, Isabel got dressed in a way she hadn't gotten dressed in years. Not because she needed armor. She had stopped believing in armor. But because she wanted to inhabit herself fully. She wore a gown she had chosen with deliberate care. Deep navy, almost black, with a structured neckline and a train that pooled behind her in a way that felt, she thought, like intention. Her hair was up. Her heels were the kind that made a sound on marble floors. Ren, who was 13 months old and had recently discovered the word no and the concept of cause and effect, was with Isabel's sister for the evening. Isabel had kissed her daughter's forehead, breathed in that particular smell, warm skin and something sweet, and felt something settle in her chest, an anchor, the most reliable one she had. Alistair picked her up at 7. He saw her come down the front steps of her building, and something in his expression shifted in a way he did not try to conceal. He did not say, "You look beautiful," in the automatic way that men say it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "I'm glad you called." She thought that was exactly the right thing to say. The car was a town car, not a limousine, exactly, but long enough, and black, and it pulled up to the Fairmont's entrance just as a cluster of Marcus colleagues were arriving from a cab. Isabel recognized 2 of them. They recognized her. She watched the calculations happen on their faces, the surprise, the reassessment, and she felt nothing in particular about it. Or rather, she felt something clean and quiet that she did not have a word for yet. Alistair offered his arm. She took it. They walked into the Chateau Laurier together. The ballroom was exactly as Marcus would have wanted it. Extravagant in a way that required money, and announced it. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls. Table settings in ivory and gold. A string quartet playing Debussy in the corner, with the particular concentration of musicians who know they are background and have made their peace with it. Every surface held something that cost more than it should. Isabel had designed spaces like this, and she knew what they were for. They were for the person at the center of them to feel, briefly, large. She walked in and felt large enough as herself. The reaction was not immediate. The room was full, and people were mid-conversation, mid-glass. But she moved through the space with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove, and that ease was its own kind of announcement, and slowly the room began to notice. She saw Marcus before he saw her. He was standing near the head table, in conversation with two men she didn't recognize, laughing at something with the practiced ease of a man who has arrived at the life he always believed he deserved. He was, she acknowledged privately, objectively good-looking. He had always been. That had never been the problem. Then he looked up. The laugh did not leave his face immediately. It took a moment, a beat too long, for his expression to recalibrate, for some version of what he saw to reach him. And she watched it happen, the arrival of information he had not prepared for. Isabel, not diminished, not apologetic, not wearing the defeat he had scripted for her. Isabel standing in the Fairmont Chateau Laurier, in a dress that had not been bought on a budget, beside a man Marcus had read about in the business section twice in the past year, looking like the protagonist of her own story. Celeste noticed a moment later. Isabel watched the sequence of her expression too, though with less interest. There was a type of woman who organized her self-worth around other women's failures, and Celeste, she understood now, was that type. She had built a relationship on the ruins of someone else's and called it elevation. The arrival of information that the ruins had rebuilt themselves must have been genuinely disorienting. Isabel did not feel triumph, exactly. She had expected to feel triumph and found instead something quieter. Something like the satisfaction of a room when the proportions finally work. When every element is in its right place. When the light falls correctly. When the thing is simply, at last, what it was meant to be. She was approached, before dinner was served, by several people. Some she knew, some she didn't. A woman who had been at her and Marcus's wedding, and who pressed her hand warmly and whispered, "It's so good to see you looking this well." A former colleague of Marcus's, who had clearly come over out of curiosity and left the conversation newly thoughtful. A couple from the West End who turned out to know Alistair's work and launched into an enthusiastic discussion of a project in Kanata that Isabel had not known about. She talked. She listened. She ate the very good salmon and drank a glass and a half of white burgundy and declined the second refill with the ease of someone who knew her own limits. Alistair was good company in the way that mattered most, which was that he did not require management. He could hold a conversation. He could exit one gracefully. He understood, without being told, that this evening belonged to her, and arranged himself around it without appearing to do so. Marcus came to find her during the cocktail portion, after the toasts. She had expected this. He crossed the room with the particular stride of a man who has decided to appear magnanimous, and she composed her face into something neutral and waited. Isabel. He kissed the air beside her cheek, in the way he had always kissed the air beside people's cheeks. "I'm glad you came, Marcus." She kept her voice even. "Congratulations on your wedding." He glanced at Alistair, a brief flicker of something, reassessment, recalibration, that he covered quickly. "Great to see you doing well." "Thank you," she said. "I am." There was a pause in which Marcus seemed to be searching for the version of this conversation he'd rehearsed, the one in which he had the power, and finding that it didn't map onto what was actually happening. She watched him locate a version of dignity and put it on. "How's the little one?" he asked. "Wren," she said. "Her name is Wren. She's wonderful." "Good," he said. "Good." He lingered another few seconds. She counted them, almost. And then he moved away, back toward Celeste, toward the table setting and the chandeliers and the life he had built on the narrative that she was less than she was. She watched him go and felt, finally, the thing she had come here for. Not revenge, not triumph. Something more specific and harder to name. The experience of being seen accurately. Of having a room full of people recalibrate a story that had been wrong about her, in real time, without her having to say a single word to correct it. Sandra Ossie's profile of Isabel ran 6 weeks later, in the magazine's Architecture and Culture issue. The headline read, "Building on Her Own Terms, How One Architect Redefined What Recovery Looks Like." It was not about Marcus, not explicitly. But it was about the years after, about the work and the partnership and the project with Alistair's firm that was already attracting attention beyond Ottawa. It was about Wren, briefly, in the way that Isabel had approved. A mention, warm and undramatic, of the daughter who had clarified everything. There was a photograph taken at the project site. Isabel, in a hard hat and her good coat, standing in what would become a courtyard, looking up at a framework of steel and light, with an expression that the photographer had caught by accident, she thought, in the brief moment between two conversations. An expression of someone who knows exactly what something is going to become. The child support arrangement was finalized without further contest. Marcus paid on time, the first month and every month after. One evening in late June, when the Ottawa River was warm enough to walk beside without a jacket, Isabel took Ren out after dinner. The baby, 16 months now and recently confident on her feet, though not yet reliable, walked the first block on her own before demanding to be carried, which Isabel did without complaint. She settled Ren on her hip and walked down toward the water, where the light was going gold and long across everything. Ren pointed at a duck with the intensity that babies point at ducks. "Da," she said, which meant either duck or that, or simply I see something, and I need you to know. "Yes," Isabel said. "There it is." She stood there a while, her daughter's weight solid and warm against her side, the river moving easy in the evening light. She thought about the ballroom, about the way Marcus' face had looked when he saw her, about the moment she had stepped through those doors not as a woman undone by her circumstances, but as a woman who had, simply and without drama, built something better. She thought about Alistair, who was coming for dinner on Saturday, and who had asked, in that careful and unhurried way of his, whether she would consider spending a weekend in Charlevoix, sometime, when the timing worked. She had said maybe, which they had both understood meant yes, eventually, when I'm ready. He had nodded and not pushed, and she had appreciated that more than she could say. She thought about the firm, and the Canada project, and the 2 new proposals on her desk, and the particular satisfaction of work that was entirely and recognizably hers. She thought about the woman who had filled out those admission forms alone in a hospital waiting room, handshaking, Marcus's unanswered name in the emergency contact field. She thought, she made it here. Ren leaned her head against Isabel's shoulder with the absolute, uncomplicated trust of someone who has decided that this is a safe place to rest. Isabel pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, held her a little tighter. The duck swam on. The river ran south. The sky above the Gatineau Hills went from gold to pink to the kind of deep, clear blue that happens in Canada in summer. The blue that feels almost extravagant. And Isabel Crane stood in it and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.